Okay, here I am again, back on chapter 3, reading about George and Marina, the Duke and Duchess of Kent. This can be found at any thrift store, thriftsbook.com. Look for it on Amazon and see if somebody's selling this book. It's such an easy read. It has 16 chapters. I'm on the third chapter now, and they're very short. And I'm just going to read them in case somebody's interested because they have such a wonderful history and their support of the monarchy, the British monarchy during George V, George VI, Queen Elizabeth's time, and now King Charles has a tremendous support from the Kents and the Gloucesters, and they have an important history and links, and they do such a good job of supporting the royal family. This particular couple, George and Marina, they were a beautiful, beautiful couple in their time. This Marina was elegant, and I have a little video that lasts about a minute and 25 seconds, and it's got a little slideshow that shows pictures of George and Marina when they were first married, and you see how beautiful they were. And their children, the three children when they were young. Edward, Alexandra, who was a very close cousin to Queen Elizabeth, they were all so close, and they were a wonderful support to Queen Elizabeth. And when you see Prince Edward up on the balcony with Queen Elizabeth, in her last platinum jubilee, and you see Prince Michael, you know, he has done a lot for the queen, so he helped acquire some of these Russian jewels for Queen Elizabeth and the family. So, but it's 16 chapters. I'm on chapter 3, and this chapter is entitled Politics and Battleships. So I appreciate your patience because I'm new at this. Chapter 3, Politics and Battleships. The return journey to Greece at the end of the last Russian holiday in 1914 contrasted sharply with the arrival of Prince and Princess Nicholas and their three children only a few weeks earlier. Traveling back through Russia, this time aboard a crowded, stuffy train, the family's progress was made even longer and more uncomfortable by repeated delays as their train was halted and shunted into sidings to permit heavily laden troop trains immediate passage. In Romania, the Nicholases rested briefly at Pelisor, part of the larger Palace Castle it was a complex that King Carol had built at Sinaia in the Carpathian Mountains. Before continuing their homeward journey aboard a special train the king put at their disposal, by the time they had crossed from Romania into Serbia, Marina and her sisters, weary and hot, had started to become fractious. The heat was unbearable, Prince Nicholas would later write. We had no water, and the children cried until a railway station were able to purchase a watermelon with which to quench their thirst. The discomforts of that particular journey almost remained vivid in Marina's memory, who, many years later, recalled the heat and the flies and the long, dreary day, and eventually the watermelon that tasted so good. Not so good, however, was the discovery as they reached the frontier between Serbia and Bulgaria that their luggage, as well as their servants, had disappeared. Exasperated though they were by the turn of events, frayed nerves were calmed by the sight of Marina and her sisters capering around in the diaphanous night dresses that had been loaned to them by the wife of a local station master. In her 1937 book with the grandiose title The Intimate Life Story of H.R.H., the Duchess of Kent, told for the first time and presented with the personal approval of Her Royal Highness, The Russian-born violinist and biographer Baroness Helena von der Helven wrote, "Those garments were not exactly of the Paris model type, and raised peals of laughter when one of the three sisters simply disappeared in its voluminous folds or tripled over its trailing hem." One final stop at Salonika broke the family's long and tedious journey home to Athens. This time, though, the interruption was one of choice rather than necessity. A private pilgrimage, it evoked memories of triumph as well as tragedy. In November 1912, Greece had engaged Turkey, its oldest and most bitter enemy, in a battle over sovereignty. The campaign itself was brief, and at its end, the Greek army, under the command of Prince Nicholas's brother, Crown Prince Constantine, had secured a decisive victory, which culminated into the seizure of the vital Macedonian port of Salonika and Thessalonica, as it is also known. Freed from the tyrannical rule of their Turkish oppressors, the people celebrated in a frenzy of near hysteria, welcoming the Greek crown prince as a hero and throwing themselves to the ground in front of his horse. No less jubilant was Constantine's father, King George I. Greatly loved though he was by his people, the king was already announced his intention to abdicate the following year in favor of his eldest son. Although his family attempted to dissuade him, George I was determined to hand his crown to the younger man. "I shall have reigned for 50 years," he said, "and it's long enough for any king. I think I'm entitled to a little rest in my old age. Besides, Tino, Crown Prince Constantine's family name, will be able to do far more with the country than I ever could. He was born and bred here, while I am always a foreigner." Foreigner or not, the Greek victory of Salonika represented the greatest triumph of King George's entire reign. To honor that achievement, he decided to live there for a time, choosing a house on the shores of the Gulf of Thermae, from where he would rule. Few kings could ever have felt more secure in his people's affection than George I, whose arrival in Salonika had been marked by overwhelming demonstrations of loyalty. Yet, just 4 months later, on 18 March 1913, the still prevalent air of jubilation was shattered by the king's assassination. Accustomed to walking around the streets of Athens with his same freedom each of his subjects enjoyed, George I thought nothing of doing the same in Salonika, exchanging the time of day with any and all who greeted him. On the afternoon of his death, the king, accompanied only by his aide-de-camp, Colonel Francadus, set out for his usual walk along the waterfront. 2 hours later or so, just after 5 o'clock, as they made their way back, the king and his ADC passed a rundown cafe from where an anarchist identified as 40-year-old Androsthenes, who police claimed to be a deranged Macedonian, walked up behind him, drew a revolver loaded, according to one contemporary report, with 7 bullets, and shot the king several times in the back from a range of 6 feet. Well, that's sad. With formal confirmation of the king's death, it fell to Prince Nicholas to summon leading officers of the Greek army, and in a voice choked with sobs, as it was described by the press at the time, invited them to swear fealty to his brother, the new King Constantine I. Throughout Europe, King George's royal relations, devastated by the shocking news they received, were like his widowed sister, Queen Alexandra. At home in London, to whom the news had been broken by her daughter, Princess Victoria, prostrate with shock and grief. Young though she was, Princess Marina was no less heartbroken at the loss of her adored grandfather, papa, as she always called him. And indeed, there's a story that when she learned of his death, she flung herself to the floor in agony of grief. All attempts to console her were apparently to no avail, until Princess Nicholas told her youngest child, who had always been a particular favorite of the late king, papa wouldn't want you to cry like that. Do you remember that when you fell down, he was always pleased if you were brave? Constantine I came to the throne with his wife Sophie, sister of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, at his side. Earlier than intended and in circumstances none had ever envisaged, in his memories, in his memoirs, Prince Christopher of Greece would say of his eldest brother, "No sovereign was ever more popular than Constantine in the early days of his reign. The Greeks, romantic and impressionable, were ready to idolize the soldier king who had fought side by side with his men. He shared camp life with them and led them to victory. He had liberated South Macedonia, Epirus, and the Aegean Islands from the Turkish yoke. They began to remember the old legend with Constantinople should be given back to Greece and the Christian church restored there when King Constantine and Queen Sophie reigned in Athens. The tradition probably owed its origins to the fact that the last emperor to fall on the ramparts of Byzantium was named Constantine and his wife was Sophie. The people had touching faith in it. The visions and hope of the Greeks invested in their new and popular king soared to new heights. When shortly after Constantine and his forces had routed the Turks, they did the same to another of their old foes, the Bulgarians. Both Greece and Bulgaria had long claimed Salonika as their own, and in the aftermath of the Greek victory, relations between the two countries had been severely strained. Suddenly, Bulgarian troops were mobilized. Without any formal declaration of war, they attacked Salonika. Once more, Constantine emerged victorious. The welcome he received on his return to Athens was stupendous, Prince Christopher recalled. Thanksgiving services were held in all churches. Crowds besieged the palace, waiting for hours to get a glimpse of him. The spring and summer of 1914 were the most carefree, the most prosperous that Greece had ever known. It was at that time, that same carefree spirit, that Prince and Princess Nicholas and their daughters had set out for their summer holiday in Russia. But by the end of August, they broke their homeward journey at Salonika to stand before the memorial that Queen Olga had erected in memory of her murdered husband. The mood music had changed to a more somber key. With the start of the Great War, King Constantine, who had known to be something of a Germanophile, he had also undergone military training in Russia and had married a German princess, vigorously supported a policy of neutrality, despite being pressed by his brother-in-law, Kaiser Wilhelm, to bring Greece into the war on the side of Germany. Together with Austria and Hungary, Bulgaria and the Turks, was fighting against the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. It was the Entente that the Greek Prime Minister Eleftheros Venizelos wanted Greece to support militarily. Constantine's refusal to change or to modify his political stance set him on a collision course with Venizelos, resulting in the national schism. With parts of Greece occupied by the Allied forces, and in the hope that support for the Entente would lead to the expansion of Greek territory, Venizelos finally broke rank and, under Allied protection, formed a rival administration in Salonika, known as the Provisional Government of National Defense, in direct opposition to the royal government in Athens. Indeed, such were the tensions between the two men that the country was warned by civil war, royalists versus Venizelists. At the age of 10, Princess Marina knew little or nothing of politics, but as popularity for the royal family ebbed away, and the king and his supporters faced increasingly open opposition from the Entente and the Venizelists, one politically motivated incident occurred that she would never forget. In July 1916, in a summer so dry that even the birds in the trees of the parched forest fell silent, arsonists attacked Tatoy, with the loss of 16 lives and the wholesale destruction of forest wildlife. From the house Prince and Princess Nicholas had taken for part of the summer in the foothills of Mount Pentelicon, midway between Athens and Tatoy, Marina, her mother, and her sisters watched the red glow on the horizon as the royal estate burned. At Tatoy, King Constantine, his son Paul, the future King Paul I, and estate workers did the best they could to fight the fire until it threatened to surround them. When they could do no more, they made for a goat track that the king hoped would still be passable. Queen Sophie's escape was no less dramatic. Scooping up their 3-year-old daughter, Catherine, she ran for a mile and a half until, exhausted and terrified, she was picked up by a passing car and driven to the safety of Prince Nicholas's holiday house in Kephesia. The night Marina sobbed for the fawns and the wild creatures of the forest and for her pet animals at the home farm. She wept too, and at the thought of her grandfather's tomb might have been destroyed. "Have they burnt my darling papas?" she asked. The answer was no, but when it was time to take stock, less than a quarter of the estate was found to have survived the blaze. In an ever-worsening situation, Allied warships blockaded the port of Piraeus, and in October, Britain and France, frustrated by the king, Constantine's unwavering judgment that neutrality was the best policy for Greece, issued an ultimatum. On 2 December, in the belief that Constantine had finally capitulated, Allied troops marched into Athens. The strength of resistance that they encountered forced them to retreat. But the same afternoon, French battleships opened fire and for 3 hours relentlessly bombarded the city as shells exploded near the royal palace, sending the king and queen together with their household into the cellars for shelter. Prince Christopher found himself the target of snipers in a nearby street as he frantically tried to get to his car. Mercifully, he said later on, there were some poor shots in Athens then. At the Nicholas Palace, the princesses, Marina, Olga, and Elizabeth, rushed to the windows at the top floor nursery from where they watched the street violence. Below, it was not until a horrified Princess Nicholas discovered them transfixed by the bloody scenes of fighting that the children were hurried to the greater safety of the basement. Armed confrontation and intense diplomatic negotiations in June 1917 led to the French politician Charles Génard, acting in his official capacity as the Allied powers' authorized representatives in order for the king's abdication. Though Constantine refused to abdicate, he did agree to go into exile. Agreed to go into exile. Talking with him, his eldest son, Crown Prince George, whom allies considered too pro-German to be trusted, in place of the ousted king and his rightful heirs, allies chose Constantine's second son, Alexander, as the new occupant of the Greek throne. It was in the ballroom of the royal palace on the afternoon of 11 June 1917, with tears in his eyes, his voice breaking with emotion, that the 23-year-old prince swore the oath of loyalty to the Greek constitution. It was an event devoid of all ceremony and attended only by the Archbishop of Athens, who administered the oath. The king's prime minister, Alexandros Zymas, and Alexander's father and elder brother. Afterward, Constantine told the new king, Alexander I, that as a puppet king, he should regard himself as regent rather than as a true monarch. His crown, said his uncle, Prince Christopher, was a mockery, but he wore it with dignity. Entirely alone, the young king was to occupy the throne until his shocking death, little more than 3 years later, was kept under constant surveillance. His household was chosen for him. Any so-called courtiers who became too friendly were summarily dismissed. Yet perhaps the cruelest deprivation of all for Alexander was the complete loss of communication with his family. Even as he lay dying, something will come too shortly. His distracted mother, Queen Sophie, was not permitted at his bedside. In the second week of June 1917, 2 days after Alexander I assumed the role of monarch, his family set sail for life as exiles. Yet, at Oropos on the Gulf of Euboea, and these Greek names and Russian names. Yet, at Oropos on the Gulf of Euboea, in highly emotional scenes, loyal supporters massed on the landing stage and on the beach, wailing like bewildered children, attempted to prevent the royal family's departure. As Prince Nicholas would recall, the nearer of the king and queen drew to their boat, the fiercer grew the frenzy of people who tried to keep Constantine back by force. Many leapt into the sea and held fast to the boat. Among the lamentations and sobs that rent the air, the boat set slowly off, whilst all the people went down on their knees and stretched out their hands toward the king and queen. It was a heart-rending picture. Describing the uneasy mood in Athens, Prince Christopher later wrote, "The once gay little capital was like the city of the dead. No one went into the streets. All the theaters and shops were closed. Those of us of the royal family who remained behind lived in an atmosphere of suspicion. Everyone known to have been faithful to King Constantine was put under arrest. Men and women in all walks of life, the statesmen, the lawyers, the writers, the officers of both army and navy, were mysteriously denounced, hauled before a tribunal, sentenced, and some to years of imprisonment, others to banishment in remote islands. With the sole exception of King Alexander, banishment was also the fate of the entire Greek royal family. On July 4th, 1917, Prince Marina and her family, together with Prince Christopher, followed by Prince and Princess Andrew. This Prince and Princess Andrew, this was Prince Philip's parents. Prince Nicholas's brother and sister-in-law, the former Princess Alice of Battenberg, and their four daughters sailed away from Athens at the start of their first journey into exile. Initially short of money and reliant on the generosity of loyal friends, the royal party made tracks to Switzerland. There, for the next 3 years, the exiled royals remained dividing their time between Zurich and Lucerne, where they spent their summers, and St. Moritz, where they lived in the winter. Prince and Princess Nicholas felt the deprivation of exile more keenly than their daughters. With the adaptability of youth, Marina, then age 11, and Olga and Elizabeth, age 14 and 13 respectively, regarded Switzerland as a new adventure. Despite occasional pangs of homesickness, it soon became they soon became acclimatized to their surroundings. For Marina, with her nascent talent as a watercolorist, Switzerland was an inspiration. Under the tutelage of a professional art teacher, she was soon interpreting the beauty of the countryside throughout with the medium of her paintbox. No less diverting was the awakening of new interests. Among them, and in due season, were winter sports, which included skiing, skating, and tobogganing. For Marina's parents, uncles, and aunts, however, Switzerland was not such a great adventure. Despite the relative tranquility of the country surrounded as if it was the maelstrom of war, the Greek royal family was still regarded with the deepest suspicion. Here in the calm and the peacefulness of this neutral country, Prince Nicholas later wrote, "We were still marked down as dangerous political intriguers who had to be closely watched and shunned by everyone belonging to the Entente nations. As if passive hostility were not enough, the family suffered humiliation in other ways. They were not allowed to leave the country. Friends could only visit under conditions of strict secrecy, and their mail, though perhaps unsurprisingly, was invariably censored. Even Kate Fox, the princess's nurses, would not attempt from controlling influence of Grace's ruling regime, was not exempt from controlling influences of Grace's ruling regime. Summoned to the British Council, she was warned that unless she resigned her position with the traitors, as the family was described, and returned immediately to England, her passport would be confiscated. Outraged, but faced with little choice, she told the family as she prepared to leave that she would come back to them, and when peace did finally return, she kept that promise. Uncomfortable though exile was for them, Prince and Princess Nicholas faced up to it with admirable stoicism. Yet even so, most of the claims made in later years by the more romantically minded, the family experienced nothing but hardship, and when compared to the wealth and privilege that they enjoyed at home when the going was good and would be again, the Nicholases did find themselves obliged to live within their means, keeping a careful eye on expenditure and seldom indulging in anything that might be considered unnecessary or luxurious. In practical terms, Prince Nicholas also decided to utilize his skills as a painter. This helped supplement his family's resources. Of the opinion that he painted at least as well as Mr. Winston Churchill, Britain's future and most celebrated prime minister, was also a gifted amateur painter. Prince Nicholas rented an artist's studio in the Montreux suburb of Terre-Tête. Before long, under the pseudonym Nicolas Le Prince, he staged his first exhibition. His paintings not only sold well on that occasion, but they continued to do so afterwards. In time, Princess Marina, who, as we saw earlier, earlier, often joined her father on his painting trips at home in Greece, would find her own work, including watercolor portraits of her sisters, her daughter Alexandra, and her niece, Princess Margaret. They are displayed in public exhibitions or occasionally published in magazines such as Vogue. Professional soldier, painter, and even playwright, though Prince Nicholas might have been, he was above all a family man, and at home on Sundays, he'd always been set aside for informal family gatherings at the royal palace. But in exile, the royal family continued to see much of one another, though concern for the young King Alexander, isolated in Athens, meant that get togethers were sometimes rather melancholy affairs. For Prince and Princess Nicholas, there was also anxiety about their respective mothers, the Dowager Queen Olga and Grand Duchess Vladimir. At the start of the Great War, both women, one a Russian Grand Duchess by birth and the other by marriage, had, like other members of imperial families, established military hospitals. Queen Olga was at the family estate at Pavlovsk, not far from Tsarsko Selo, and Grand Duchess Vladimir's Kislovodsk, a fashionable spa town in North Caucasus. With the outbreak of the revolution, both women found themselves dangerously cut off. Even though Prince Christopher, as he put it, helped his mother Olga, would be perfectly safe among the people who had known her since childhood. With members of the imperial family being taken captive by the Bolsheviks and brutally murdered, it was a vain hope. As it turned out, delicate and strenuous diplomacy on the part of the Danish embassy in St. Petersburg or Petrograd, as it had now become, resulted in Queen Olga being able to leave Russia in July 1918, was finally reunited with her family. In his memoirs, Prince Christopher recalled, "My mother was only the ghost of her old self when she joined us in Switzerland. The months of worry and suspense and the privations she had undergone had worn on her to skin and bone. The event in Greece had tortured her with anxiety. Far away from us all, she was unable even to give accurate news, and in addition, she had the grief of losing 17 members of our family. Three among them were her nephews, Prince Ion, Constantine, and Igor Konstantinovich, Tsar Nicholas and Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, the Tsar's younger brother, and Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, the Tsarina's sister, who in her widowhood had established and became abbess of the nursing order and community of Saints Martha and Mary in Moscow. In the Russian Revolution, like everyone else who came out of Russia, she was half starved. For a diet of bread soaked in oil, it is not exactly nourishing, and it was some time before she recovered her health. Traumatic though Queen Olga's experience had been, it was not until February 1920 that Grand Duchess Vladimir, who held the dubious distinction of having been the last of the Romanovs to do so, was able to get out of Russia. Before escaping aboard a fishing boat to Anapa, an ancient town in the northern coast of the Black Sea, Marie Pavlovna's house in Kislovodsk was said to have been searched by revolutionaries on no fewer than 22 occasions. Having spent 14 months in Anapa, the Grand Duchess, who had refused earlier opportunities to escape via Constantinople, lest she should be subjected to the indignity of being deloused, finally agreed to go when the White Russian commander, General Wrangel, told her he could no longer guarantee her safety. Without further protest, the Grand Duchess Vladimir, the grandest of Grand Duchesses, set out on what would be an uncomfortable 7-week journey to the port of Novorossiysk. There, purely by chance, she met another imperial escapee, her husband's niece, the Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, sister of Nicholas II, who, on a journey that would take her via Istanbul and Belgrade, eventually reached Denmark, where she joined her mother, the Dowager Empress. Of that meeting, Ian Voras wrote in his 1965 biography, The Last Grand Duchess. Olga would recall, disregarding peril and hardship, Marie Pavlovna stubbornly kept to all the trimmings of bygone splendor and glory. And somehow she carried it off, when even generals found themselves lucky to find a horse cart and an old nag to bring them safe to safety. Aunt Maiken made a long journey in her own train. It was battered, all right, but it was hers. On 13 February 1920, Grand Duchess Vladimir finally embarked on an Italian ship bound for Venice. From there, traveling via Paris, she made her way to Switzerland. Like Queen Olga, the indomitable Marie Pavlovna stepped down from her train, the shadow of her former self. At the age of 66, white-haired and thinner than her family, she could remember ever having seen her. She was completely worn out by her long ordeal. For several weeks, she enjoyed the company of Nicholas, Ellen, and the 3 granddaughters before traveling on to Contraville, a famous health resort in northeast France, where she hoped to recover her health. Instead, it just deteriorated, and only 2 months later, on 6 September, Grand Duchess Vladimir died. Sudden and even perhaps tragic though her death was, in Greece at that time a far more tragic incident was about to claim the life in which, in many ways, had hardly begun. So that was the end of chapter 3. It was a good chapter. It just kind of outlines the troubles, the instability of the Greek monarchy at that time, and it took a long time for them to get back on their foot. And it was a different time. World War I, Russia. I mean, when you're a royal, used to all those privileges, and then you have to go into exile. But I thought it was quite interesting how Nicholas was able to supplement their income with his artwork, his watercolors, and it's quite interesting. So I will adjourn for this particular session, and the next session that we'll read about is A Brief Return, Chapter 4, and I'll save that for tomorrow.